Let's transition into our next topic of actually kind of a very, very similar vein of playing defense versus offense. And Dr. Rod, this is, you got really excited when we chose we were going to talk about this one. Let's talk about politics for a moment. And let me ask you a question. I'll ask you a question, but then I'll follow it up with a statement is, are we in a recession? Because there's all this stuff that's going on, and there's all these these articles of the American government, the United States government changing the definition of what it is, and then it's not them, it's some other, it's three guys in a room that actually make the decision on whatever. Like there's all these different levels of things of what a recession is, and there's a difference between a felt recession and an emotional recession and a practical one and all this sort of stuff. Obviously, coming out of COVID, everyone's hurt. But then there's also a lot of people that have really greatly benefited also. So, Dr. Rod, number one, are we in a recession? And number two, how do we know?
Well, I think the answer to the first question is no, we're not in a recession. And that generally applies to most of the world's economies. But obviously different economies have different experiences across time and also at the same time. Yes, there's been a significant debate, particularly in the United States, over what is a recession. And, the political sides have, I guess they've put their stakes in the ground. I would say this, though, I think there's a significant danger that most of the significant economies in the world will fall into recession over the next 6 to 12 months. A lot of the debate has been over whether or not you've got a recession after you've recorded 2 successive quarters of what we call negative growth. That is where your growth in your what we call gross domestic product, or in some cases gross national product, where that turns negative. So instead of growing at, say, 2%, you grow at, say, minus 0.5%. So a rough rule of thumb is that if you get 2 consecutive quarters, that amounts to 6 months of negative growth, then you are in recession. But look, take the case of Australia. We've still got what we call full employment. Our unemployment rate it's been around 3.5% for a little while now, and we know that there'll always be some unemployment because there are people who are between jobs, and there are people who are just entering the workforce and so on and so forth. So there will always be a certain level of recorded unemployment. But in Australia's case at the present time, we've got an almost exact match between job vacancies and the number of people who are recorded as being unemployed.
Yep.
So we've got full employment, even though the economy clearly is slowing down. That hasn't yet shown in the official figures, but we know anecdotally, for example, that products are shifting much more slowly out of warehouses. As you know, a lot of people do online shopping now. Online shopping is taking a bit of a cooler at the moment, and that, I think, is a pointer towards a more widespread slowdown into the future. I think the biggest issue for us right now is inflation, and that inflation is pretty much self-induced. It's the result of very, very high government spending during the COVID pandemic, where
high
governments
spending?
virtually
what do you
all
mean?
over.
What
Pardon?
How did the government spend money? Did they really? Did they? Really?
Yeah, I know. They spent like drunken sailors. Apologies to anyone who happens to be a drunken sailor. But, I think history is going to be quite unkind to many governments because of the way they reacted in a policy sense to the pandemic. You see, one of the effects of the pandemic was to actually slow down what we call the supply side of the economy.
Yeah.
That inevitably causes a temporary increase in prices while you've got those issues on the supply side. What happened on the supply side? Production slowed down because so many people were sick. It also slowed down because of government imposed lockdowns and other restrictions on employment of people who had symptoms, et cetera, et cetera.
And speculation.
There were disruptions to supply chains. That's compounded, of course, by the war in Ukraine, given that that area of the world is a very substantial producer of agricultural products. So the problem with government spending is it increases demand. It does absolutely nothing to improve the supply side of the economy. What it does is that it increases demand. Now, because of the pandemic restrictions, people were increasing their savings. They were getting bigger and bigger bank balances. They couldn't spend the money.
Yeah.
And since the restrictions have been lifted, of course, they've been able to spend the money. And that has compounded the issue of price rises associated with the supply side of the economy. That's why I call this a self-inflicted bout of inflation. And what we're doing to deal with it, in most countries, we're not reducing government spending. In some cases, we're not even reducing the rate of growth in government spending, but we're doing it through increasing interest rates.
Yeah.
And that will definitely slow things down. It will slow demand down, but it's not going to help the supply side because it makes borrowing more expensive. And so businesses are not going to invest in improving systems and increasing their production and perhaps robotizing more of their production so that they're not so reliant on human beings in production and so forth. That's not going to affect the supply side at all. So yes, we've certainly got an inflation problem. I don't think we've got a significant recession problem yet, but let me tell you, if interest rates keep going the way they are, they're very rapid increases, then we're going to have a self-inflicted recession following self-inflicted, or maybe I should say a government-inflicted recession following government-inflicted inflation.
Yeah.
And we'll know when there's a recession. See, most people know when there's a recession because it's more difficult to find a job, or your hours of employment each week go down. And economists would actually define a recession by looking at a number of different factors, including the published factors on the published data on economic growth, but they also look at what's happening to the rate of unemployment and the growth of new jobs. They'll look at what's happening to what we call real income as well, what purchasing power households actually have, and that will be affected by things like the level of prices, the level of wages, and the rate of unemployment, of course. And we also look at things like consumer spending. So our household spending, what they used to spend on things like motor vehicles, fridges, washing machines, and entertainment, those kinds of things. So economists would generally look at a whole range of data before they make a decision as to whether or not we're actually in a recession. But I do think right now, the kind of data to keep our eyes on would be things like what's happening to stock in warehouses. That's a particularly important indicator at this time.
Yeah, so kind of back to your point about like robotizing the workforce and people like doing big investments into, because let's bring this back to a leadership conversation, because we as leaders need to be able to make the right decisions now. How do we innovate right now in, quote unquote, a recession or a speculative recession? Because you're talking about like investing into robotizing workforce. While we saw a spike during COVID of demand and everything, there was also obviously the supply side. It was the issue with the supply side was because all the big manufacturers, all the big companies thought that there was going to be a downturn, so they cancelled all their orders, they stopped production, they slowed everything down in preparation for a slowdown in demand. But then it was a reverse. Now we're seeing that demand, as you say, kind of fall back into, not really like you say, cool off, but it's kind of just becoming normal. It's kind of balancing out now. I kind of speculating on that, but obviously the reason why a large organization isn't focusing on investing in robotizing their workforce, investing in increasing production, because how do we know how long it's going to last for? So how do we, as a business owner, make sure that we innovate during that time by getting machinery that we do, like, so that we can increase production, increasing our workforce, increasing our, all those things we need to do around our business to be able to take advantage of the increase in demand? How do we do that without overcapitalizing and then finding ourselves, holding the bag, so to speak, if it just all falls over tomorrow?
Well, in one word, carefully. Do all this carefully. Look, I think fundamentally, though, we've got to go before God, and we've got to be assured in our own minds that we're not going to participate in this recession.
That's good. Yeah.
Now, I'm a great believer in that. Look, I do believe in what some people loosely call the prosperity gospel. You know me better, Craig, than somebody who would just preach prosperity without also preaching the whole of the gospel of Jesus Christ. But look, fundamentally, our businesses should do okay all the time.
Yes.
That's not to say that there won't be challenges.
Yeah.
So I think first of all, our mindset should be saying to us, we're not going to participate in the recession. So we are not going to be a failing business. I think the next thing, which is very practical, is to keep asking the question, how do I best solve somebody's problem?
Yeah.
That question is there all the time, regardless of where we happen to be in the business cycle.
It's good.
Businesses that continue to successfully solve somebody's problem, they will thrive. And they do thrive regardless of what's happening overall in the economy.
Yeah, it's good.
You mentioned, and I mentioned before you, that during the one of the responses to things like COVID and its effect on the workforce would be to actually replace people with machines. Now, we've seen a lot of that happen over time as wages have increased and so on, and that there tends to be displacement of certain jobs. People fear that, but in fact, throughout history, technology has never actually done away with work.
Yes.
And the reason is new needs begin to emerge, or work that was previously done within households actually finds its way into the market. So just one very simple example of this would be gardeners and lawn mowing companies. Most of the people I know now pay someone to mow their lawn.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I was talking to a young fellow just the other day who's about to start up a lawn mowing business, and he'll do jobs around the garden and so on, trimming hedges and such like, and he'll do quite well. In fact, not long ago he was looking at buying a business and a lawn mowing business, and look, the asking price was as much as you would pay for a house in one of the major cities in Australia. So that's a reasonably good business, and it's not recession proof, but it's a reasonably good business, because that's an example of what economists call production that has moved out of the household and into the market.
Yeah, that's
the
good.
Same things happened in the area of, for example, childcare, where now often both parents are working, and so children go into childcare. And I have both a daughter and a wife involved in childcare, and Christian childcare. I think is a wonderful, wonderful thing for us to be able to access. So we've got to keep focused, I think, all the time on delivering the solution to somebody's problem successfully.
Yeah.
It's very important that we focus on keeping income up.
Yeah.
You see, in business, you can maintain yourself, sustainably in the financial sense, either by increasing revenue or reducing costs, or some combination of the two. I think reducing costs is something we should always be looking at. It's not something we should only do during a recession, but we shouldn't see that as the savior for our business.
Yeah, that's good.
In other words, managing prudently means we should always be looking at what's happening to our cost base, but our primary focus needs to be on increasing revenue. Again, go to the Lord, pray issues through. Do I need to change something about the product that I'm offering to the market?
That's good.
You know, we talked a little bit about replacing people with machinery earlier. I think there's a role for that as well. There are lots and lots of areas in which robots can now be used. I have a particular interest in what's happening in the agricultural industry. Here in Australia, we do have a particular problem attracting workers into agriculture, partly because so much of the work is in remote areas, so much of that work is seasonal. We're now seeing the development of machinery that can harvest crops, that can maintain crops relatively cheaply and very, very efficiently.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of applications of drone technology, for example. I have a nephew who was a commercial pilot, and that industry went through some pretty tough times a few years ago. So he actually got out of flying big aeroplanes into drones. Yeah. And he's developed a very, very successful and innovative business with drones. And basically in his business, he trains people how to use drones. And drones are now being used in many different applications. Here in Australia, they're being used to look for sharks in the water to keep our beautiful beaches safe. So surf life-saving clubs are now using them. A drone can even deliver a life-saving vest or something to somebody who's in trouble in the ocean. And they can do that within minutes, like within maybe 2 or 3 minutes of a distress signal. They're being used on building sites for security, for example. They're being used many applications in agriculture to deliver insecticide to a plant, a single plant in a whole field that has, say, an insect attack. So long before an insect or worm attack can sort of spread throughout a crop, these things can actually be identified and dealt with straight away without going to the expense of, maybe spraying through the whole crop. There are all sorts of innovations going on.
Yeah, it's great.
And, I think it's a good thing. All of us who are entrepreneurial, who are leaders in the business world, read all you can about the innovators. It will really, really encourage you. Yeah. And that you too can be an innovator in your own area.
That's great. I love what you said before about being a problem solver, right? Solve a problem. That was something that I learned when I first got into business. Like that was actually one of the big keys that I attribute my success to. Is at the end of the day, I've just focused on being able to solve problems. That's it. Yes, I've had different titles or business names or whatever, but at the end of the day, all what I was a problem solver. I identified a problem and found a solution to it. And that's what innovation is figuring out how you can, if you can identify a problem and come up with a solution for it, you will be recession proof, because there is, and I want to end on this, is there are endless, and you've heard them all, amazing stories of recession businesses. Google and the whole gamut of these big businesses that actually started in recessions. Why? Because they found a problem and they provided a solution for it. And so I believe us as leaders in the business world especially, we can very easily protect ourselves against the ups and downs of a recession by innovating. Find a problem, find an innovative way to solve that problem, and you will find yourself not being affected by the recession and hopefully be a success story. Hey, that was an excerpt from our On the Cube Leadership podcast. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, put a comment below. And if you want to see more content like this, faith-based leadership development content, make sure you check out our channel, give it a subscribe, and hit the bell notification so that you'll be notified when we release new content.